Welcome to this story. Elam McCade had grown accustomed to silence. Not the gentle hush of a town winding down at dusk, or the sleepy murmur of neighbors across a fence line, but the kind of silence that pressed against the ears like a weight. Out here, on the edge of New Mexico's high desert, 40 miles from the nearest town, silence was its own creature. It crept into the rafters, seeped into the boards of the porch, and waited patiently in the corners of the rooms. The ranch had been his father's, and before that his grandfather's. 3 generations of McCades had worked the land, breaking it into sections, fencing it, branding calves in the spring. But by the time Eli inherited it, he was the last. His brothers had gone off to cities. His sister married a man in Texas, and his mother had long since passed. That left him alone, a broad-shouldered man of 54 with weather-cracked hands and a permanent squint from decades under the sun. The house itself was modest, 2 stories, with a wide porch, weathered wood that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. A single light burned most nights in the front window, not because Eli needed it, but because he couldn't stand the thought of the place looking abandoned. Beyond the house stretched miles of grazing land, sagebrush, and stone outcroppings that turned gold at sunset. To the west, the San Cristobal Mountains rose in jagged shadow, a reminder that the land here could be as cruel as it was beautiful. Eli's days followed a rhythm as steady as the tick of a clock. At dawn, he fed the horses, patched whatever fence line had given way overnight, and checked the water troughs. By midday, he usually found himself in the barn, oiling tools or repairing tack. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch with a tin cup of coffee and listen to the coyotes stir. That was his world, quiet, unchanging, safe, and yet there was always an undercurrent of unease in such silence. Eli would never admit it out loud, but nights could stretch long and strange. The wind in the canyon sometimes carried sounds that didn't belong the snap of a branch, a voice carried too far. More than once he'd woken in the small hours with a distinct feeling that someone had been standing outside his window, watching. When he'd mentioned it in town, the men at the feed store only chuckled and said it was the coyotes, or maybe the loneliness catching up to him. Eli wasn't so sure. That night in late spring, the stillness was heavier than usual. Clouds had gathered at dusk, low and gray, promising rain. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, so distant it seemed more like a memory than a sound. The horses were restless in their stalls, stamping and snorting. Eli struck a match and lit the lantern in the barn, the glow casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. He worked methodically, tightening the latch on one stall door, adjusting the cinch on an old saddle that had worn thin. He found comfort in the small tasks. But each time the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of wet earth, he felt a prickle along the back of his neck. It was a familiar sensation, one he had learned not to ignore. Out here, alone, you relied on instinct as much as on skill. If something felt off, it usually was. When the rain finally came, it came hard, drumming on the tin roof, rattling against the shutters of the house. Eli leaned against the barn wall, listening. The sound was almost soothing until it wasn't. Beneath the pounding of the storm, faint but unmistakable, came another sound. At first, he thought it was the cry of a coyote. But coyotes didn't cry like that. This sound was thin, ragged, then filled with something sharp and human fear, maybe, or pain. Eli stiffened, holding his breath. For a long moment, the sound vanished, swallowed by thunder. Then it came again, carried on the wind, a voice, broken, desperate. It was a plea. The lantern light flickered as if reacting to the shift in the air. Eli pushed off the wall, heart thudding faster now. He'd lived on this land long enough to know how unforgiving it could be. If someone was out there, wandering the desert in a storm, they wouldn't last long without shelter. Still, he hesitated. He told himself it could be a trick of the storm, some echo of the wind in the canyons. He told himself he didn't owe anyone a thing, he was alone because he chose to be. But the cry came once more, faint yet clear enough this time to freeze him in place. Please, don't. Eli set the lantern down carefully, his jaw tightening. Whether it was madness or truth, he couldn't ignore it. He pulled his coat tight against the rain, reached for the rifle leaning by the barn door, and stepped into the storm. The silence of his ranch had been broken, and something was waiting for him out there in the dark. The storm had grown into a living thing. Rain hammered the hard-pan earth, turning the dust to mud in minutes, and the sky split with sudden flashes of lightning that painted the world in white-blue light. Each rumble of thunder rolled across the land like a warning. Eli McCade trudged through it with long, deliberate strides, the brim of his hat pulled low to shield his face, his coat already soaked through. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, but steady. He'd carried it across hunts and nights when rustlers prowled. It was more an extension of his arm than a tool now. The cry he'd heard was still in his ears, though he hadn't heard it again since leaving the barn. Out here, sound played tricks. The canyon walls and low ridges could twist a coyote yelp into a woman's scream or turn the bellow of a bull into something unholy. He told himself that as he moved through the downpour, but it did little to settle the unease gnawing at him. Lightning lit the corral in a sudden burst, and for a moment he thought he saw movement. A shadow slumped against the posts. He blinked rain from his eyes, lifted the rifle halfway, and stepped closer. It wasn't a shadow. The figure was small, curled in on itself, clothes plastered to the skin by the rain. Eli's boots sank into mud as he closed the distance, his pulse climbing. When he was close enough to see clearly, the figure stirred, lifting its head. It was a young woman. Her face was pale beneath the streaks of dirt, lips trembling from the cold. Dark hair clung in wet strands to her cheeks, and her eyes, wide and glassy, fixed on him with a mixture of fear and pleading. "Ma'am?" Eli's voice was rough, louder than he meant it to be against the storm. He lowered the rifle slightly and crouched beside her. "You all right? You hurt?" Her lips moved, and though the rain and thunder drowned most of it, he caught the words. "Please, don't touch me." The way she said it froze him where he knelt. Not just the words, but the terror in them. Her voice cracked on the last syllable, as though even speaking it caused pain. Eli drew back a fraction, hands open in a show of calm. He had no idea who she was or what had driven her out into this godforsaken storm. But she was shaking violently, her thin blouse plastered to her skin, her arms wrapped tight around herself as if holding in what little warmth she had left. "You'll die out here," Eli said, his voice softer now. He tipped his hat back, trying to meet her eyes through the rain. "I won't hurt you. Just need to get you inside, out of this weather." She shook her head weakly, mumbling words he couldn't make out, her gaze darting past him into the darkness as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Eli felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He turned, scanning the horizon, the ridges, the fence line beyond the corral. The storm obscured everything in sheets of water, but instinct told him they weren't alone. He had no time to wrestle with her fear. Carefully, deliberately, he set the rifle aside in the mud where she could see it. Then he shrugged off his heavy coat and laid it over her shoulders without touching her skin. She flinched at the weight of it but didn't push it away. That was something. "Come on," Eli said, rising to his feet. "Barn's just there. Fire inside the house. You can rest. Then we'll figure out what's got you running." Her eyes met his for the first time then, wide and hollow, as if she'd already seen more than a person could bear. For a moment, Eli thought she might speak again, but instead she simply let her head fall forward, her strength spent. Eli stooped, gritted his teeth against her earlier plea, and lifted her carefully, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. She was lighter than he expected, frail enough that he feared she might break under his grip. She let out a small, broken whimper, but didn't resist. The storm swallowed them as he carried her toward the house, each step slow and deliberate across the slick ground. Eli kept glancing over his shoulder, rifle still lying in the mud where he'd left it. It felt wrong to abandon it, but something in him said carrying her was more important. By the time he reached the porch, his arms ached from holding her, and his heart beat in a way it hadn't in years, not from exertion, but from the gnawing certainty that this woman's appearance was no accident. Inside, the fire still smoldered in the hearth. Eli shouldered the door open, kicked it shut behind him, and carried her into the dim, flickering light. She stirred again as he lowered her onto the worn sofa, her hand catching at his sleeve with surprising strength. Her eyes found his once more, and this time the words came clear, sharp as broken glass. "They'll come back. Don't let them take me." Eli froze, his damp hat dripping onto the floorboards, his boots leaving tracks of mud. Outside, the storm raged on. But it was nothing compared to the storm he knew had just entered his house. The fire snapped and hissed as Eli fed it another log, the warmth pushing back the chill that clung to the house after the storm. The woman lay slumped on his worn sofa, swaddled in a blanket he'd fetched from the upstairs bedroom. She hadn't spoken since her warning at the door. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her lips moving now and then as if caught in some private argument with herself. Eli crouched by the hearth, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw. He wasn't a man used to company, let alone company that arrived half dead in the middle of a thunderstorm. The situation pressed on him in ways he couldn't name. A stranger in his house was one thing, a frightened stranger whispering about people coming back for her, that was something else entirely. He poured hot water from the kettle into a chipped mug and dropped in a tea bag. Coffee was his usual, but he figured tea might sit easier in her stomach. He carried it to her side and set it on the table within reach. "Got something warm here," he said quietly. "Help you shake the cold." Her eyes flicked open, just enough for him to see their startling gray color before they darted away. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, shrinking as though his very presence weighed on her. "I won't touch you," Eli assured her, holding his hands up as he backed a step away. "Ain't my business what put you out there. But you'll freeze if you don't take something warm." Her lips parted. For a moment he thought she'd speak, but instead she let out a low, trembling sound, half sob, half gasp. Then, as if gathering every shred of will she had left, she whispered, "Don't let them take me back." The words were so faint Eli had to lean closer to be sure he'd heard right. "Who's them?" he asked. Her hand shot out suddenly, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. Her nails bit through the fabric into his arm. He froze, not wanting to startle her further. "They'll find me," she whispered. Her eyes darted toward the window, toward the blackness beyond the glass. "They always find me." Eli swallowed hard. He'd seen fear before, men trapped under horses, a ranch hand once bitten by a rattler, even his father the day the doctor said the cancer had spread. But this was different. This wasn't fear of dying. This was fear of living, of being dragged back into something worse than death. "You're safe here," Eli said, keeping his voice steady though his stomach tightened with unease. "No one gets past my land without me knowing." Her grip slackened, but she didn't let go entirely. Her gaze moved back to him, searching his face as if weighing his words. Finally, her voice broke again, fragile and hoarse. "Please, don't touch me." The same plea she'd given outside. Only now, up close, he could see how much it cost her to say it. Her whole body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, an ingrained terror that went bone-deep. Eli nodded slowly. "All right, No touching. You got my word." He eased back and settled into the old armchair across from her, the firelight painting deep lines across his face. He didn't press her with more questions, though 1,000 burned on his tongue. Who was she running from? How far had she come in the storm? Why his ranch? Instead, he let the silence stretch. The storm outside had dulled to a steady patter on the roof, a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. Now and again, the horses stamped nervously in the barn, unsettled by something beyond the rain. The woman shifted under the blanket, drawing, her knees up toward her chest. Her breathing evened just slightly, but her eyes remained open, fixed on the fire. Eli studied her in the glow. She couldn't have been more than 25, maybe younger, though the shadows under her eyes aged. She bore the look of someone who had carried too much weight for too long. "You can rest here tonight," Eli said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "Come morning, we'll figure out the rest. No one's gonna harm you while you're under my roof." She gave no reply, but her eyes flicked toward him once, then back to the fire. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. Eli leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He set the rifle across his lap, his thumb brushing the worn stock out of habit. He told himself it was precaution, but the truth sat heavy in his gut. Whoever she was, whatever she'd fled, wasn't finished. The storm outside was moving on. The storm inside his house was only beginning. The fire burned lower, its warmth filling the parlor with a soft glow that pushed against the shadows. Eli sat in his chair, heavy rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the woman curled on his sofa. She hadn't touched the tea, though steam still rose faintly from the mug. Her lips moved from time to time, words too faint to catch, as though she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Eli wasn't a man who pried. Years on the land had taught him patience, that sometimes answers came only when a body was ready to give them. Still, the unease gnawed at him. A stranger shows up, half dead in a storm, terrified, begging not to be touched. He'd heard wild stories in town now and again, about border runners, cartel dealings, even old ghost tales about the mountains. But none of those stories came with flesh and bone. Curled up on his couch, shaking like a trapped colt. He rose quietly, set the rifle against the hearth, and went to fetch another blanket from the cedar chest upstairs. When he returned, he laid it on the arm of the sofa, careful not to brush against her. Her eyes opened anyway, sudden and wide. She flinched at his shadow as though expecting a blow. "It's just a blanket," Eli said gently. "You're shivering." "You'll need it before long." For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she stretched one trembling hand and drew the blanket down over her shoulders. Her eyes never left him. Eli nodded once and stepped back, giving her space. The rain eased outside, shifting from a hammering torrent to a softer drizzle. Eli could hear the wind moving through the junipers now, and the drip of water off the porch roof. The storm was passing, but something about the quiet it left behind didn't sit right. She stirred again under the blankets, her voice a thin thread in the silence. "They'll come back." Eli leaned forward. "Who will?" Her gaze flicked toward the dark window, then back to him. "They don't stop." "Not ever." Her words raised a chill that no fire could chase. There was a flatness to the way she said it, as if she wasn't guessing, but remembering. "You're safe here," Eli said firmly, though part of him wasn't sure he believed it. "This ranch folks don't just wander onto it. If someone's hunting you, they'll find out quick enough they picked the wrong patch of land." At that, a faint sound escaped her throat, something between a bitter laugh and a sob. "You don't know them." Eli rubbed his jaw. No, he didn't, and she wasn't offering more. Still, he'd heard enough to know trouble was circling. Rose and crossed to the window, pushing back the curtain. The rain-slick land stretched empty in the lantern light. No movement by the barn. No shapes along the fence line. But his gut told him to trust less what he saw and more what he felt, and what he felt was eyes on him behind him. The woman shifted again, muttering. The words were broken, spilling like fragments of a nightmare. Chains? The dark room. Screaming, "Don't take me back." Eli turned slowly, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Whatever she'd been through, it wasn't something ordinary folk should have to carry. The sight of her so young, so hollowed out, lit a slow fire in his chest. "You're safe," he repeated, his voice low, carrying the weight of a promise. He wasn't sure he'd be able to keep. She looked at him then, her gray eyes glassy but searching. "Why?" she whispered. Eli blinked. "Why what?" "Why would you care?" The question hit harder than he expected. For years he'd lived with no one but his horses and the silence. He didn't care much what happened beyond his fences. But looking at her, he couldn't find it in himself to turn cold. "Because I reckon you've had enough people not caring," he said finally. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing more. She lay back, her eyes slipping closed again, the blanket pulled tight under her chin. Sleep, or something close to it, finally claimed her. Eli stayed by the fire long after, rifle back in his lap, his ears tuned to every sound beyond the walls. The storm had passed, but the night carried a different weight now. He knew one thing for certain. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't finished, and neither was he. The morning arrived gray and low-hanging, with mist curling across the pastures like smoke. Eli woke before the sun, as he always did, boots hitting the floorboards silently. The woman remained on the sofa, buried beneath the blankets, her breathing steady but shallow. She hadn't stirred yet, and the quiet of the house pressed in around him. Heavier than any storm. Eli poured himself black coffee, steam curling into the cold air of the kitchen. Outside, the storm had left the land soaked and treacherous. Mud clung to the boots he'd left by the door, and the horses stamped nervously in the corral, uneasy with the wet. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the property. The fence line had survived the storm, the corral post still standing. But near the barn, something caught his eye. Disturbed ground, footprints muddied and fresh, trailing from the edge of the tree line. Eli knelt to inspect them. They were human. 2 sets boots, not shoes one larger than the other, moving deliberately toward the house before fading into the tall grass. The mud made them easy to spot, yet there was a care in the stride that made his stomach tighten. These weren't random wanderers. He traced the prints back toward the woods. Whoever had been here had skirted the property, careful not to disturb the corral too much, but deliberate in leaving a message. "We know where she is." His pulse quickened. Inside, the woman murmured in her sleep, words low and tangled. Eli's stomach turned. She was in more danger than he had realized, and he'd sworn to keep her safe. He returned to the house quietly, boots heavy with mud. She shifted under the blankets, her eyes half-lidded, watching him like she expected something to leap from the shadows behind him. "They've been here," he said softly, lowering himself to the arm of the sofa. "Footprints. Fresh." Her eyes snapped fully open. Fear flashed, quick and raw. No, they can't." Eli shook his head. "They came close, but not inside. Not yet." Her hands gripped the blanket tighter, knuckles white. They will," she whispered. "They never stop." Eli's jaw clenched. He didn't know what they were. Exactly, man. Some kind of gang, maybe worse, but he knew enough to feel the weight of their pursuit. Years of running cattle, facing rustlers and wolves, hadn't prepared him for this. The stakes were human, flesh and blood, terrified and hunted. "Listen," he said. "You're staying here. Don't go outside until I know it's safe. I'll check around, make sure nothing's close. You understand?" Her lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed as if she might refuse. But the exhaustion in her eyes too old for her 20-something face, won out. She nodded slightly, retreating deeper under the blanket. Eli grabbed his hat and stepped outside again, scanning the perimeter. The land stretched far, but the storm had made it messy. Trees bent under the damp weight. Mud puddles reflected gray. Skies and the faint tracks he'd found earlier vanished near a ridge. Whoever it was had experience. They weren't sloppy hunters. They moved carefully, deliberately, leaving just enough evidence to terrify anyone who might notice. He followed the ridgeline slowly, rifle up, ears straining. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and hay, but also something metallic faintly. In the air distant, but not the storm. His mind raced. Could be nothing. Could be a trap. Returning to the house, he found her still on the sofa, eyes flicking toward every shadow, every movement beyond the windows. "They're close," she whispered without prompting. "I know them by the way they move. They'll try again." Eli nodded, though a cold knot formed in his gut. He hadn't seen her alive for long, and already the danger he'd promised to shield her from had crept closer than the storm ever had. He set the rifle across the table, then knelt beside the sofa, careful to keep a respectful distance. "You? Stay here. Don't worry about a thing. I've got this." Her eyes searched his face, the gray pools wide and haunted. Finally, a shiver ran through her, and she buried her face into the blanket, whispering words he couldn't catch. Eli stayed there for a long moment, listening to the wind in the trees, the dripping of water off the roof, the horses shifting restlessly. Then he rose, moving toward the window again, scanning the land. The tracks outside weren't just a warning. They were a promise, and whatever they were coming back. Night fell slow and heavy over the ranch, the kind of darkness that pressed against windows and seeped into every corner of a house. Eli kept the fire low, the glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the land was silent except for the occasional creak of a tree branch and the distant stamping of horses in the barn. But the quiet didn't soothe him. It tightened around his chest, a warning he couldn't ignore. The woman remained on the sofa, wrapped in layers of blankets. She had drifted into a fitful sleep hours before, murmuring fragmented words that sounded like warnings or memories. Her hands clutched the blankets so tightly it left pale imprints on her skin. Eli couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about the footprints he'd found earlier and the certainty in her voice that they never stop. He rose quietly, moving toward the window overlooking the pasture. The moon broke through the clouds, casting silver streaks across the wet grass. For a long moment he saw nothing, until a shadow shifted at the edge of the tree line. Eli froze. Not a deer, not a stray dog. Something or someone was crouched just beyond the fence, moving carefully, deliberately, as though testing the boundaries of his land. His pulse quickened. The rifle felt heavier in his hands than it had all day. Loaded and ready, its stock worn smooth from years of use. He crouched lower, eyes narrowing. The figure was human-shaped, dressed darkly, moving with a patience that spoke of experience. Eli didn't breathe. One step wrong could mean discovery. Then a low sound reached him, a whisper carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably a voice, soft, deliberate, calculated. The hair on his neck rose. Whoever or whatever was out there knew the woman was inside. They were testing him. He moved back silently, closing the curtain and blocking the light from the fire that might give them a glimpse inside. His mind raced. The land was wide, the fences sturdy, but a desperate intruder could find a weak point. The woman helpless under blankets was within reach of danger, and he had no way of knowing how many were out there. Minutes passed like hours. Then he heard it, A soft scrape at the back door, almost inaudible over the wind. Eli tensed, heart hammering. Slowly, he raised the rifle, listening. The scrape came again, deliberate. Someone was trying to enter. Not break-in testing, like he had suspected. The cold logic of the intruder sent a shiver down his spine. He stepped quietly toward the door, rifle raised, senses straining. A shadow flitted across the porch, just beyond the weak light of the fire through the curtained window. Eli whispered under his breath, "Stay there. Don't move." Inside, the woman shifted in her sleep, murmuring words that sent an unfamiliar dread crawling up his spine. He could feel the tension in her unconscious form, as if she were sensing the presence outside in ways he couldn't. The scrape came again, closer this time. Whoever it was had circled, found a spot near the latch of the back door, testing its strength. Eli's mind raced. He could fire, but that would alert others if more were out there. He could confront them and risk the woman's safety. Or he could wait, silently, hoping the intruder made a mistake. The scrape changed, a soft thump, then silence. Eli held his breath. Then, without warning, a shadow moved along the side of the house past the kitchen window. The hair on his arms bristled. Whoever it was had circled around, just beyond sight. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fire. They were patient, calculated, familiar with fear. And the woman inside, the one who had begged not to be touched, was the reason. He crouched near the sofa, keeping the rifle ready. The woman stirred again, lifting her head slightly, her eyes opening to the firelight. "They're here," she whispered, hoarse and urgent. Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could hear the faint, deliberate steps outside, circling the house, testing the boundaries. The first night visitor had arrived. And this wasn't the storm he could wait out. This was something far darker. He tightened his grip on the rifle, heart pounding. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were patient. They were clever. And they wouldn't leave without her. The night stretched on, long and unyielding, and Eli realized that nothing about this chase was ordinary. Nothing about this fight for survival would be simple. And the fire, once comforting, now cast shadows that whispered of the danger closing in from the darkness beyond the windows. The night had thickened into an oppressive black, the kind that presses against skin and seeps into bones. Eli stayed crouched behind the sofa, rifle clutched tightly, listening to every subtle sound, the shifting of the woman under the blankets, the distant moan of the wind, the faint drip of water from the eaves. Then a noise came that made his stomach drop, a soft, metallic scrape against the back door latch, deliberate and precise. Eli's pulse thumped in his ears. He could hear breathing outside now, slow, measured, patient. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't here by accident. They were hunting her. He pressed himself lower against the sofa, every muscle coiled like a spring. The woman stirred, groaning softly, eyes flicking open. She didn't speak, but her gaze darted to the window, then the door, as if she could sense the presence lurking in the darkness beyond. The back door shivered under a forceful but controlled pressure. Someone was testing it, pushing just enough to see if it would give. Eli raised the rifle, finger on the trigger. "Stay back," he whispered to himself more than anyone else. Then came the sound he had feared, the snap of the lock giving way. Almost imperceptibly, like a slow, sinister sigh, the door cracked open a fraction, and the shadow fell inside. At first it was just a dark shape, blending into the night, moving with a predatory patience. Eli could see nothing but the outline, but it was enough. A tall figure, deliberate in its movements, advancing silently across the wooden floor. The woman's breathing caught. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, eyes wide and frozen. Eli rose slowly, rifle raised, aiming carefully. "Who's there?" "Get out." His voice cracked like a whip in the silence, sharp and commanding. The shadow paused, head tilting slightly, as though amused by his threat. Then a slow, deliberate step. Forward. Eli fired. The shot rang through the house, echoing off the walls, sharp and final. The shadow halted, then crumpled to the floor with a muted thud. Dust and splinters rose around it as the firelight flickered across the room. Eli approached cautiously, rifle still raised. The figure lay motionless, face obscured in the shadows. He crouched lower, trying to make out details. Then the firelight caught at a mask, pale and expressionless, and a glint of steel in its hand. Clutched loosely even in collapse, the woman gasped. It's them," Eli froze. "How many?" Her eyes darted to the windows, the corners of the room, as though counting invisible threats. More? Too many? The realization hit him like ice. This was just the first. Whoever or whatever was after her had patience. They had strategy. And now they knew he was protecting her. That made both of them a target. Eli backed away, keeping the rifle trained on the fallen intruder. His mind raced. He had no time to check the rest of the house. Any noise might attract others. The woman trembled beside him, clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. He could feel her fear like a tangible thing pressing against his chest. "Listen to me," he said, voice low and urgent. "You stay behind me. Do exactly what I say, don't make a sound." She nodded, eyes wide, her body shaking under the weight of exhaustion and terror. Outside, the wind carried another sound, soft, deliberate, scraping across the porch. Others were circling, testing the boundaries, waiting for a mistake. Eli realized with a cold clarity that the storm of the night had passed, but a far darker storm had arrived. He grabbed a flashlight from the table and swept it toward the windows. Shapes moved just beyond the glass shapes, human enough, careful. Enough to avoid drawing attention, but unmistakable in their intent. The woman gasped again, her voice a trembling whisper. "They won't stop." Eli pressed the barrel of the rifle against his shoulder, muscles taut. "Then neither will I," he muttered. He wasn't a hero. He was a rancher who had survived storms, rustlers, and isolation, but this was different. This was calculated evil. And it was hunting the person he had vowed to protect. The shadow on the floor shifted slightly, as if testing life. Eli tensed, ready to fire again. The woman pressed closer to him, whispering broken words he couldn't fully catch. Fear filled the room like smoke, thick and suffocating. Then came the sound of footsteps outside, lighter, more patient. They were circling, moving with strategy. Eli knew he had only moments to make a decision. He couldn't just wait. They would come inside again if he did. The first night visitor had breached the house. And Eli knew this was only the beginning. The house had become a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, felt like a foul, like a foul, like a foul, like a fada once. Predator circling. Eli moved silently, rifle in hand, eyes darting to every corner. The woman remained behind him, huddled under the blankets, trembling, but watching everything with wide, terrified eyes. The intruder on the floor stirred, a faint groan escaping behind the mask. Eli didn't flinch, keeping the rifle trained. He knew better than to relax. Whoever, whatever, was outside was patient, methodical. They'd wait until he made a mistake. Eli moved to barricade the back door with a heavy wooden chair, wedging it against the latch. Every motion had to be deliberate. Any sound could alert the others circling outside. The house that had once felt safe, familiar, was now a trap, walls closing in with each heartbeat. "They're everywhere," the woman whispered, voice hoarse. Her eyes darted toward the windows, then back at the shadow on the floor. They know this place." Eli didn't answer immediately. He studied her, the way she flinched at every shadow, the tension coiling in her body. He'd seen fear before on cattle rustlers, on wild animals, but this was different. This fear was ancient, primal, and he could feel it feeding the danger around them. Then came a faint tap, tap, tap at the living room window. Eli froze. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost taunting. His stomach knotted. Whoever was out there wasn't just hunting. They were toying with them. "Stay down," he whispered, pressing her flat against the floor. She obeyed, burying her face against the carpet, muffling her quiet sobs. He moved closer to the window, rifle ready, and peered into the darkness. Beyond the glass, he saw shapes, figures moving just out of reach of the firelight, careful to stay in shadow. They weren't all human, or at least not all ordinary. Something about their posture, their deliberate, unnatural stillness, made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Eli turned to the woman. "Do you see them?" She nodded slowly, eyes wide. They don't blink right." A chill ran down his spine. He'd heard stories in hushed tones, warnings of men who moved like shadows, hunters who were more than human. He'd never believed them until now. The intruder on the floor groaned again, more forceful this time, twisting slightly. Eli noticed a glint of steel under the firelight, a knife, thin and sharp. He kept the rifle aimed, but knew he couldn't stay frozen forever. "Keep your head down," he said. "And whatever you do, don't make a sound." The woman nodded, hands clenching the carpet fibers, teeth set tight. Then came another sound. Low scratching at the front door. Someone or something was testing the other side. The house was trapped between threats, and Eli realized with a sinking certainty that he was surrounded. He moved cautiously toward the kitchen, scanning for objects he could use to barricade windows, doors, anything that might slow them down. Pots clattered quietly under his grip, heavy enough to throw if needed. Every second stretched, the air thick with tension. Every shadow a potential attacker. The woman whispered again, trembling. They want me. I can feel it. Allies." Jaw tightened. "I won't let them take you," he muttered. His words felt inadequate in the face of the darkness pressing in, but they were the only promise he could make. The shadow on the floor twitched suddenly, and Eli's muscles coiled, ready to fire. But then it stilled again, motionless, like a statue. His pulse raced. The intruder's patience mirrored the ones outside. They weren't reckless, they were calculating, and Eli knew that patience worked against him. One moment of hesitation, one wrong step, could end everything. The house groaned under the wind, the intruders outside shifted, and the woman clutched the blanket so tightly her fingers whitened. Eli pressed back against the wall, rifle steady. Heart hammering. The night wasn't just long, it was endless. Shadows moved, steps circled, and every sound magnified the fear that filled the rooms. They were trapped inside, hunted from all sides, with only the walls between them and something darker than any storm Eli had ever faced. And as the minutes dragged into hours, Eli realized the most dangerous thing wasn't the figures outside it, was the knowledge that, sooner or later, the darkness would find a way in. Eli crouched in the corner of the living room, rifle trembling slightly in his hands. Every shadow seemed to move on its own, and every sound from the walls or outside carried a menace that made his skin crawl. The woman huddled beside him, face pale under the firelight, gripping the blanket like a lifeline. The intruder on the floor remained motionless, its mask glinting faintly in the flickering fire. Eli hadn't dared move it or examine it closely, not knowing if it was alive, unconscious, or something far worse. The house groaned around them as if echoing the threat, and a cold wind whistled through the cracks in the old windows, carrying whispers he couldn't quite understand. Then, from the darkness outside, a new sound reached them, a faint, rhythmic. Tapping at the side window, almost like claws scratching the glass. Eli froze, eyes narrowing. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. Someone or something was signaling, probing, teasing them. "They're testing us," Eli whispered to the woman. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "They're not human," she said softly. I've seen them before. In the woods, at night, always watching." Her words sent a shiver through Eli. He had never believed in legends or ghost stories, but the certainty in her voice, combined with the unnatural patience of the intruders, left no room for doubt. This was something else, something older and colder than any human. Suddenly, a noise came from the attic. A soft, deliberate footstep, careful and measured. Eli's heart raced. He hadn't heard anyone move upstairs, but now he realized they might already be inside the house, hidden, waiting for the right moment. "Stay low," he hissed, motioning to the woman. "If they're upstairs, they'll come down. We can't let them take you." Minutes passed in tense silence. Then came a whisper, carried faintly from above, a voice so low and distorted it made Eli's skin crawl. The words were unintelligible, but the intent was clear, threatening, predatory, familiar yet alien. Eli realized the truth. They weren't just surrounding them. They were inside the walls, in the shadows, everywhere at once. The intruder on the floor wasn't the first. It was the scout, the one that had led them here. And now the others were closing in, hunting. Quietly, patiently, strategically, the woman pressed closer to him. "They want me," she whispered. "They always come for me." "I can feel it in their eyes." Eli gritted his teeth. He had faced storms, thieves, and wild animals, but this was different. This was intelligent, patient evil. And it wasn't here for anything else. It was here for her. A scraping sound came from the far hallway, followed by a soft thump. Eli's eyes darted toward the source, catching a fleeting shadow moving just out of the firelight. It paused, watching them, and then melted back into darkness. He realized something terrifying. They weren't just physical threats. They were hunting him psychologically, wearing him down, isolating him from escape, making every corner of the house a potential death trap. Eli gripped the rifle tighter, jaw clenched. He couldn't run. The woman couldn't run. And if they were this clever, the walls themselves might conceal more than intruders. They might conceal death itself. The intruder on the floor shifted suddenly, and Eli flinched. It wasn't fully unconscious. Its mask tilted slightly, as though studying him, calculating, alive in ways he didn't understand. The thought made him realize something far worse than fear. He was outm@tched. Outside. Footsteps moved deliberately across the porch, then stopped. A shadow passed a window, motionless, staring. Eli's stomach knotted. The house had become a trap, and the trap was closing. The woman whispered again, voice trembling. "They never leave. They can hide anywhere. Watch." Eli's mind raced. They weren't just human, not entirely. They were something older, something that adapted, something that hid in plain sight until it struck. And tonight, their focus was entirely on the woman beside him. He realized, with a cold clarity, that the fight wasn't just for survival. It was a battle against an intelligence that had anticipated every move, every instinct, every fear. He could summon. And as the shadows outside and above them shifted, as the whispers and scratches echoed through the old walls, Eli understood. The hidden threat wasn't just around them. It was everywhere, and the night was far from over. The hunt had only just begun. Eli's muscles burned from hours of tension, yet he didn't lower the rifle. Every sense was heightened, every shadow a potential threat. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of terror. Outside, footsteps and whispers continued, patient and deliberate, a chorus of malice that seemed to come from all directions. The woman trembled beside him, clutching the blanket like a shield. They're inside us," she whispered. Her voice cracked under the weight of fear, yet there was a clarity in her words that froze Eli in place. "What do you mean?" he asked, voice low but urgent. They hide in plain sight," she said, "in walls and shadows, in the corners of your eyes. And they follow, always follow." Eli's stomach sank. He had sensed the unnatural patience of the intruders. But now he understood this wasn't merely about breaking into the house. It was about control, manipulation, fear itself. They were predators who had perfected the art of terror. Then a low scratching sound came from the ceiling, followed by a faint creak of the attic door above. Eli's pulse surged. They had breached the interior completely. It was only a matter of time before the attack would become direct. He motioned to the woman. "Stay close. Whatever happens, do not run. Do you understand?" She nodded, wide-eyed and pale, her trembling nearly uncontrollable. Eli scanned the room, eyes catching the fallen intruder. Something about the figure on the floor made him pause. A faint movement, almost imperceptible. Slowly, carefully, he stepped closer. The mask tilted, and a chilling realization struck him. It wasn't human in the traditional sense. Its eyes glimmered with an unnatural, calculating intelligence, and its body shifted unnaturally under the mask. "It's not human," Eli whispered. "None of them are." The sound of footsteps from the hallway snapped his attention back. Shadows moved, elongating unnaturally along the walls. Figures emerged slowly, deliberately tall, silent, and masked. They circled him, careful to stay in the dim light, feeding off the fear radiating from both him and the woman. Eli gritted his teeth. "I won't let you take her," he shouted, though his voice betrayed the edge of desperation. Then the woman spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "They fear the light," she said. "The fire, it burns them." Eli's gaze darted to the fireplace. He grabbed a nearby lamp, tossing it onto the hearth. Flames roared to life, casting long, flickering shadows. The figures recoiled slightly, hissing in a sound that was almost inhuman. Eli realized this was the first sign of hope. Light could drive them back or at least slow them. They advanced cautiously, yet the fire forced them into the shadows, unable to step fully into the room. Eli backed toward the center, rifle raised, heart hammering. Then the truth became horrifyingly clear. The intruders weren't just hunters. They were guardians of a twisted ritual, and the woman was a key, a target for some unknown purpose tied to her very being. Their patience, their strategy, their silence, it all pointed to one thing. She was meant to be claimed, not killed. Eli's mind raced. He couldn't simply fight them physically. He had to outthink them. Using the fire as a barrier, he shouted, "Back! Stay away!" and hurled heavy objects at the advancing figures. They recoiled, and for a moment he saw panic in their movement, something rare, almost human-like, in their unnatural composure. The woman stepped forward, trembling but resolute. "They feed on fear," she said. "Don't give them fear. Be calm." Eli forced himself to breathe, focusing on the warmth of the fire, the tangible presence of the woman beside him. Slowly, deliberately, he took aim, firing carefully at the closest intruder. The figure crumpled, yet the others hesitated, watching, calculating. And then it happened. The remaining intruders melted into the shadows, slipping back toward the edges of the room and the walls. They were withdrawing, patient, biding their time. Eli lowered the rifle slightly, adrenaline still coursing through him. The woman sank to the floor, hugging her knees, her eyes wide but unbroken. "They won't stop," she whispered. "But we survived tonight." Eli nodded, a grim understanding settling over him. They had won this encounter, but the threat was far from gone. The hidden predators, the watchers in the shadows, would return. He realized that survival wasn't about defeating them completely. It was about enduring, staying vigilant, and protecting her at all costs. The house was silent again, except for the crackling of the fire. Shadows still lingered in the corners, reminders that darkness could never be fully banished. Eli reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "We'll face them," he said quietly. "Together." And as the firelight flickered against the walls, casting both warmth and elongated shadows, Eli understood the final truth. The terror wasn't over. It had only revealed itself, and in that revelation lay the haunting certainty they were never truly safe.